Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the FSB National Webinar on creating a niche for your business. I'm Ruth Lambert, one of the development managers with the Federation of Small Businesses, and I cover Somerset and Wiltshire. And thank you so much for joining us today. I'll shortly be handing it over to our guest speakers today. So George Swift and Tracy Miller from Bigger, Brighter, Bolder. Thank you so much to both of you for doing this session for us today. I've heard you speak before and you were great, so I've got very high expectations, no pressure. So George will be our main speaker today with Tracy supporting him, and he's going to speak for probably about 30-40 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions at the end. So if you have any questions as we go along, or want to ask anything, then just please put them in the Q&A box which is at the bottom of your screen. Please don't put them in the chat. In fact, I don't think the chat is going to work. Just put them in the Q&A, and then it's nice and easy for Tracy and George to pick them up and answer them for you, and hopefully we'll have time to get through most of the questions. We are recording this session today, so don't worry about taking too many notes. You will be able to watch it back via our on-demand page on the FSB website, and don't forget, if you'd like to have a transcription, so you'd like some sort of subtitles to help you access this today, then you can switch that on via your controls at the bottom of the screen as well. So please do feel free to do that. If you aren't yet an FSB member, we'd love to have you as part of the FSB family. So if you'd like to find out more about that, please do have a look at the FSB website, which is fsb.org.uk, and you can book a meeting with one of our membership advisors, or you can just have a look at all the benefits of membership, which are loads, via the website there, and find out how we could help your business. So I'm now going to hand over to George and say thank you so much again, George, and the floor is yours.
Awesome, thank you very much. Hopefully everyone can hear me. Is that good? Can you hear me, Trace? Give me a wave, just let me know I can be heard. Can I be heard?
We can
hear good, you. Right, just double check, that's all. Just thought I'd better double check on this thing. Okay, nice one, guys. Listen, so today we are here to talk about niching. So first of all, I want to thank you for being here and giving up this hour. And my aim, as always, is to reward you as much as I possibly can in the time allotted. We're going to be talking about the importance of niching. I know you've heard it before. The fact that so many of you have registered for this shows me that it is a topic, however, that is in your mind. There's a whole load of reasons why people don't niche, okay, through fears and doubts, or maybe not knowing how to. So today I'm going to take you through a whole bunch of stuff, right? So we're going to be looking in no particular order. We're going to be looking at raising prices, making sales easier, making marketing easier, reducing your workload, increasing your clarity to your marketplace and also to yourself, differentiating yourself, raising your positioning, accelerating your growth, improving your scalability, and being of far greater value to your clients. That's quite a lot of upside to niching. Now, a lot of people, when they talk about niching, they talk about it in very kind of singular terms, all right? We're going to be looking at it holistically and the holistic impact that has on your business. However, before we get stuck in, I'd like to do a very quick poll, if you would like to play along with me. So if we get the first poll up, please, that'd be great. And I'd love to know who we've got on this call at the moment live. So if you could just tick one of those boxes, it is anonymous, we won't know who's who. I'd love to know where you are. So, you know, are you in your startup phase of your business? Excuse me. Startup phase is you're just about to start, thinking of starting, having just started, or maybe you're in that kind of first sort of 6 months or so, maybe even the first year. I'd probably call that kind of the startup phase. You're not a startup, but you're still under 100K. So you might be doing 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 a year, something like that, or over 100K, okay, or over 100K. And you're looking to scale your business. I'd love you to fill that in just so we know who we've got, what demographic we've got on this call right now. While you're doing that, we'll check in with that in just a little bit. For people that don't know me, other than maybe what you've checked out online, etc., my name's George Swift. I am the founder of Bigger, Brighter, Bolder and Success Groups. Bigger, Brighter, Bolder is in its 13th year. Success Groups is in its 11th year. And in that time, I've personally mentored over 500 small business owners, from startups and launch phase businesses all the way through to multi-million-pound enterprises. And I'm just waiting to see what this poll says. I can't see the poll. Should I be able to see the poll? I don't know if I should be able to see the poll results. I can't see them at the moment. But keep tapping away. Let us know who's on the call. Oh, here we go. The results are in. Excellent. 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 Right. So startup phases, 31% of you, 1/3 of you love it. Excellent. You're not alone, right? Entrepreneurism is a valid career path now. It's what I say to all young people that will listen to me. It's a valid career path, not something we sometimes, in the old days, accidentally fall into, or for those exclusive people. 5.5 million of us in the UK. I got that stat off the FSB. Down, unfortunately, 400,000 from the year before, which is the first time in 20 years we've had a drop like that. Given what we've all gone through. Okay, not startup, but under 100K, 50% of you, and 20% of you are over 100K. Awesome. So the content today, just so you know, whether you are launching, I mean, I wish I'd had this content when I was launching personally, right? To get it right from the get-go. And I do share this content with my launch members. It's really valid also if you're in that 100K mark, because if you're under the 100K mark, it's about maybe taking a little bit of a step back and building some of the foundations in your business so you can take it to 100K. And for you guys over 100K, I've got 30 members at the moment in my success groups who are doing over 100K towards £1 million. And every single one of them, I've put them through this content as well. It's so important that we just go back and just make sure that we are doing what I would call some of the basics, even though a lot of people maybe skip this step a little bit, some of the basics in creating the foundations of a successful business. So the content here is going to be valid for all of you. It's good to see 30% of you starting out. I love that stat. 20%, you're doing well. Over 100K, you're already in the minority there. And for you guys that are under 100K, this is absolutely a fundamental step in getting your business to that 100K mark. Why do we say 100K is so important? For me, and given all the companies I've worked with, my own included, once you start breaking that 100K, you start to have options, right? From there, you can start to create the lifestyle business that maybe you always wanted. Or if you want to start to scale your business and start to build that bigger business, maybe build that business empire, you can start to do it from that point as well. Okay, so you'll see that I have some notes. I look down occasionally at my notes. The reason being, this is probably like the 10th talk I've done in about 2 weeks on different subjects. I just want to make sure that I don't go off script and start giving you other valuable, but maybe not necessarily scripted content. It's never been more important. It's never been more important to niche than it is right now. It's been really, really tricky out there for us for a couple of years or so. Some businesses have been in the right place, in the right market, at the right time, and it's been really good for them the last couple of years. For most of us, we've had to work pretty hard and graft pretty hard. And maybe had to re-engineer our businesses, maybe take our businesses from being, offline businesses to online businesses, or certainly do a lot more stuff online. So it's been a bit of a wobbly couple of years. The FSB statistics show that when, over the last 20 years, with our numbers have got like 2.1 million, I think, if I remember accurately, to 2.1 million new businesses or extra businesses, sorry, over the last 20 years. And every year our numbers go up. So we lose some, unfortunately, but we always gain more than we lose. And this is literally, just an unprecedented period because of what we've gone through. We're not out of the woods yet. We know the economy is not in the best place. We're kind of all half expecting some bad news later in the year and stuff like that. And because of that, whilst this is what I would call absolute best practice in a booming economy, a flat economy, or whatever else we might be going into, as we go into maybe slightly tougher times, more challenging times, it becomes like twice as important to do the stuff that really works. So all the way through like the lockdowns and everything else, with all my members, I was saying to them, it's not that we're going to change what we're doing. We just need to be more diligent about doing the stuff that's the right stuff. Does that make sense? And niching is 100% one of the top things you need to do in your business. But I understand why there might be some reservations, some fears. If you're starting out, right, it could be different, like, what niche is good for me. I've got some content coming up, maybe to start you thinking about what your niche might be and give you a little simple process for starting to identify that niche. If you're under 100K, for example, you've built up a client base already, to shift that to a niche can be really quite scary because you start to worry about what you're losing. And if you're doing over 100K, you can have a lot of stuff in place with your current client base, which might be, a generalistic client base. And obviously that can be, it can be hard work, or certainly harder work to take a business that's, $250,000, $500,000, whatever, and then start to sort of niche that. However, all three levels, 100% you can niche, 100% you should be niching. And hopefully the next kind of 50 minutes, whatever we're at, 48 minutes, will convince you of that. And hopefully I can give you a little bit of reassurance as to that it is the right thing, that it's the safe thing to do. And hopefully I can start pushing you down that path where you can start to create your own ideas about what your niche might be. Okie dokie. So before we get started into the actual niching, I want to put this into context. So I'm just going to share my screen with you. This is the business model. Now, we're not going to talk about the whole thing. That would be a conversation for another day. However, I just wanted to share with you a very quick little run through of how businesses scale typically. And what happens is that they start and they kind of skip this whole phase at the beginning here, right? Okay, which is product, customer, and price. When I say skip, what happens is that an entrepreneur may well be what I call an accidental entrepreneur. You know, they were made redundant, or you had children and you didn't want to go back to full-time employment, or no one would have you on the terms you wanted, or something like that. And you said, right, I'm going to just start working for myself, maybe, you know, a little bit on the side, whatever it might be, right? And then that kind of took over, a bit of momentum, and then your business kind of formed from that. What happens with those business owners, actually, typically, when I say they skip that phase, what I mean by that is they come out of corporate, or they come out of their day jobs, and they think, right, okay, so I'm a HR consultant, I'm a marketing consultant, I'm a website builder, I'm a personal trainer, whatever it might be, right? And they say, okay, so that's what I do. And they literally skip over that, right? What's my product? The next thing they do is they say, right, okay, so how much can I charge for that? And they'll go to the market, and typically what they'll do is they'll go to the market and they'll look at the band, right? The lower end and the top end, and depending on their own personal confidence, maybe arrogance, and self-esteem, it will depend on where they charge within that. So, you know, you might go into the market thinking, oh, the low end is about £35 an hour. So I'll come in at £35 an hour because, you know, I'm just getting started and finding my feet. You might think, well, the top end's like £75 an hour. You know, yeah, I'm good. I'll come in at about 60, 70, £75 an hour. However, you're still thinking within the bandwidth of what's out there, right? As an average, as a general provider of what you do. What that does is commoditize your product. So, for example, I haven't got one here at the moment. Normally, I've got a can or something, right? If I have a can of Coke and I have a can of non-Coke, for example, if I'm selling them both as brown sugary liquid, right, I'm commoditizing them. When I sell Coke, Coke has all the power. Does that make sense? It's got the brand. It's got its position in the marketplace. Okay, and because of that, Coke will be more expensive than all other brands. How does another brand potentially compete? They don't compete directly. What they do is they find an angle so that they're not competing directly with Coke. It could be a healthier version. It could be an organic version, a natural version, whatever it might be. And they set up their own niche, if you like, within that market where, let's be honest, there's one company that dominates, the entire planet. So when we go out there and say we're a HR consultant, when we go out there and say, I build websites, even if you say I build brilliant websites, or I'm an expert HR person, or an expert marketer, or an expert recruiter, what happens is that you are just putting yourself out there as, you know, like this mug, for example, saying this is a mug. And if I say I'm an expert marketer, what I'm saying is I'm really good at holding liquid. And you market, even though you know there's good marketers and there's bad marketers and all that sort of stuff, the market is already thinking, well, that's the minimum you should do. The minimum you should be is really good at marketing. Does that make sense? So how do I differentiate this cup from any other cup? If I just want a cup that holds liquid, then I can go out and get a cup for, 50p if I buy them in bulk, £1 even if I go down, IKEA or something. So why would I spend £10 on a mug versus £1 on a mug? In fact, why would I spend £50 on a mug versus £1 on a mug? If all I want the mug to do is hold hot liquid, then they're all pretty equal, in which case, why would anyone buy the £50 mug? But we know there's a market for £50 mugs because they're on sale and people are buying them. You might even have one at home. So what we need to look at in our own businesses is, rather looking at it and saying, right, I'm a mug that holds hot liquid, I have to start thinking, okay, what else do I offer? What specifically do I offer? And you can't specifically offer something to everyone. You can only specifically offer something to someone, if that makes sense. So when you're trying to look at the market as a whole and you're comparing yourself to a market as a whole, you're commoditizing yourself. You're calling yourself brown sugary liquid rather than carving a piece of that market off yourself where you set the price, you set what it's worth. Now, ultimately, you're only going to be worth what the market will pay for you. But if you go to the general market charging average prices, then that's the kind of client you're going to win. And if you go out there with an average product, then you're going to win average clients, and average clients will pay average prices. So what we need to do is we start to need to become specialists. We start to need to niche, right? and we start to do that, then we start to stand out. And I know it can be scary, I know it can be terrifying, but as the next half hour or so will show you, there's so much on offer here holistically to your business and your work life, so much beyond maybe what you've heard before in terms of niching. So you go out and price. Well, here's what we're going to do today is we're going to buck that trend, and we'll take one step back. And what we're going to do is we're going to go to customer first. So rather than jumping straight to the price, like most people do, and then going out to the market and just selling to a general market, we just go out and do a bit of networking. We'll sell to friends, friends of friends, network, our local community, whoever's under our nose, whoever's in my Facebook group. And what will happen is we'll sell right to just whoever's available. Well, that's not a terrible strategy for starting up. It's just not the best strategy for scaling your business, which is what we're talking about today. So instead of going price and then customer, we're going to go customer. Once we've identified our customer and we've identified our true value to this customer, then we can go about setting our price. Does this make sense? Once we've got our price, right, these three here is our proposition. What do we sell, to who, at what price? And what do we sell? The product isn't HR. What we provide is whatever the result that we specifically give a specific part of that market. Does that make sense? The specific part of that market. I've been doing a lot of talks about this recently with my own club about how product companies just get this really, they just get this, right? When you're selling a product, they don't sell the product, right? Coke never sells Coke, right? It never sells brown sugary liquid, right? Because who wants to buy that stuff? What Coke does is it sells you a concept, an idea, a feeling, an emotion, an outcome, and products do it really, really well. And as service-based businesses, we sometimes don't do this so well. So what happens is we go almost like, if you look at the back of a can of drink, on the back of that can, it will say, all the ingredients on there, right? And most people, they're not that bothered about the ingredients. So we don't even look at the ingredients. That's why they're so small on the back. And then what happens is, right, we as service-based businesses, we have this terrible habit of bringing the ingredients to the front of our can. So in other words, we start talking, if you're a coach, for example, we start talking about NLP or hypnotherapy or EFT or whatever qualifications we've got. That's all ingredients. Does that make sense? You may even have some special formula that your business uses to get a specific result. That's like saying, well, Coke has a specific set of ingredients that gives Coke that very specific Cokeness. It's like people aren't that interested in that. Does that make sense? So service-based businesses, we come to the market and we start talking about our ingredients. Like my club, for example, we do goal setting and we do masterminding and we do peer-to-peer stuff and this blah blah blah, and we look at pricing and we look at modeling and we look at goal setting and we look at accountability, and that's all ingredients. And some people will turn the can over and they will be interested in those ingredients, so you do need to make those available. You may even need to put them into some sort of sales pitch at some point. However, when it comes to putting yourself out in the market, into the world, people aren't reading the ingredients. And the trouble is, when you look at the ingredients on one can of drink to another can of drink, they don't look too dissimilar. So actually, what makes the difference is how you wrap your product specifically with a specific client in mind or prospect in mind, which specifically tackles a specific problem that they have. And I'm going to share with you in a moment an analogy just to kind of hit that home. Once you've got these three in place, right, and this is what we're working on today, right, is this. Once we've got these in place, then our job is to go out and sell this. And if we don't have a niche, if we don't have a specialism, it's really hard to go out and sell our product, because what we're doing is going out there and just selling mugs. Hi, I've got mugs. These mugs are really good at holding hot liquid, right? It's quite a hard sell, especially when 98% of the market, maybe 99% of the market is also going there saying, we have mugs and our mugs are even better at holding hot liquid. It becomes really hard. However, once you've got these first three things in place, now you know who to sell to, now you know where to go, now you start to know what their specific problems and issues are. It actually makes sales a lot easier. Then we get to delivery. So once we sold, we need to deliver. Now, here's what happens. If we're delivering general products to a general market, every project we take on, right, whatever that looks like, I know different industries might not call the word projects, but every client we take on, every piece of work that we take on is potentially different from the one that we've done before. It might have similarities, of course, but it might be different to what we've done before. So what it means is, in terms of our delivery, we're jumping from going from, I don't know, let's say an engineering firm to an IT firm. From an IT firm, we might be jumping to an education business, or from an education business to a healthcare business. So when it comes to delivery, actually, it becomes a lot harder to deliver efficiently and effectively, because mentally we have to jump from very different types of projects, albeit I understand a website's a website, and albeit I understand marketing is marketing. However, there's a big mindset or big mind jump that needs to go from doing marketing for an engineering firm to jumping to doing marketing for a healthcare company, for example. It's a big leap to do. Also, software, technologies in place, your, whatever equipment that you need, right, and software to support you and stuff, that may also need to change based on different clients, depending on what business you're in. So what happens is, instead of going into, let's say like the Apple store, for example, and it's all just Apple products because that's all they do, and it's all super clean, isn't it? And it all makes sense. And when you walk into an Apple store, it's a beautiful place to be, right? And everything, everything's on brand, isn't it? Because it's all the same brand. And the shop's on brand and everything. So you go into Apple and you have this incredible experience. It's all spaced out and makes sense, and the product ranges all make sense. Compare that to, I don't know, going into a Dixon's or something, right? It's flipping chaos. You've got computers and phones and this, and then you've got TVs and something else and whatever, and it's all crammed in. And I've got, a Sony product, and I've got a Canon product, and you're comparing side by side. Does that make sense? It kind of becomes a chaos thing. So when you look at, even though I'm well aware that Apple, you wouldn't call it a niche business. Ironically, Apple's one of the major, I'm trying to think of another one that's done it, right? A company that is like a global mega company that also seems to occupy a niche at the same time, which is quite an interesting thing they've done, right? But when you walk into an Apple store, that's kind of what you want your store to be. Does that make sense? Everything makes sense, and everything's lined up, and it's all part of the same theme, and it's all part of the same range, and everyone can understand where they punch into this. Going to a Dixon's or a Curry's, for example, your clients are wandering around like, well, I'm at Cookers at the moment. Where's the TV section? Or I'm at the camcorders now. Where's my computer section? So I want you to be thinking in terms of these kind of product-based companies, because they really do get it right. Does that make sense? Now, Dixon's and Curry's, I'm not saying they get it wrong. What I'm saying is they know their market, right? They're selling general products to a general market. Apple, albeit a global mega company, is still selling specific special products to a specific special type of customer, albeit a big part of the demographic. As I say, they buck the trend, but I think it serves as an example of maybe what your website should look versus maybe what it might look like. It might look a little bit like a Curry store, but actually you want it to be a little bit maybe more like an Apple store. Does that make sense? And I don't make you, I know which one I have the better experience in, right? Even if you're not an Apple person. So delivery becomes much easier, right? Much easier when you start to niche and specialize, okay? Because you can bring everything on brand. You're only tailoring for a specific type of customer. And then once your delivery takes off and you're selling really well, what's going to happen is you're going to need to take people on to support you in your business growth, right? You guys that are doing over 100K, I would imagine most of you are not doing it on your own at the moment. You've had to go through this phase already. Well, now I've got to train my people on 10 different markets and 10 different types of customer and 20 different types of problems. Does this make sense? Much, much, much harder. If I niche to a specific audience, much, much, much quicker for my people to get on board, much quicker for them to get up to speed with, the terminology, the language of the client base, to understand the specific unique problems or the general problems which present themselves in unique and specific ways within those industry sectors. So it's much, much better for getting your people up to speed and making your people productive and efficient and effective. Marketing goes without saying, right? Okay, so whilst you'll be doing marketing all along, of course you will, okay? The reason it's in this order is what I always say, as you grow your business and scale your business, marketing becomes an increasing issue. In other words, you're selling really well, you're delivering really well, you've got people on board, your salary goes up, the salary line on your finances goes up. And what we need now is more leads, right, to pump into sales. Okay, I'll do that as a neater line, to pump into sales. Now, when I'm marketing to a general market, I'm having to post 1 minute, I'm having to post about engineering firms, and then maybe a day or 2 days later, I'm posting about HR companies, and a day or 2 days later, I'm posting about I don't know, dog boutiques or hotels or whatever it might be. So here's a client of mine. We were just working on, I don't know, whatever, brake manufacturing, right? And next client, here I am, and, we're working on swimming pool design. What it means is, right, to the market, to the world out there, you're not going to specifically stand out. And what I always say to people is, best will in the world, people aren't going to remember your name, Yes, your local people. Well, of course they will, right? your local community and stuff, the people you're already connected to. But the world at large, you know, it's so noisy out there, right? Whether it's social media or other media forms, right? It's so busy out there, so competitive that people aren't going to take the energy or apply the energy and take the time to get to know you. Does that make sense? You have to be in their mind. You've got to somehow penetrate into their world rather than expecting them to come and, you know, find out about you. So if I'm sitting there and I'm in an engineering firm and I see a post pop up about engineering, I'm going to tune in. I'm not really going to pay attention to who you are or who it is that's written the post. I'm just going to tune into that one particular post, right? Now, there'll be another post about engineering tomorrow. Won't be from you, it'll be from someone else. And there'll be another 3 posts the day after, not by you, but someone else. And I'll be looking at them all and interacting with them all, okay? 2 weeks down the line, you might post another post that's about engineering. Does that make sense? So I'm tuning back into the engineering stuff again. I don't remember you as being that person from 2 weeks ago or anyone else that I've been following during that 2-week period. So you just become part of, thank you very much, free content, but you're not standing out. I don't remember you. So people won't remember your name. They won't remember your brand. They really won't. It takes so much effort and energy to get people to get a brand. Coke, I mean, you know, the #1 most recognizable brand in the world. I mean, look what it takes to make that happen. It's everywhere. At one point, I think it was 99 cents of every dollar profit went back into product placement, marketing and communications and sponsorship and stuff. I mean, it's insane to make this, to make Coke what it is today, is that product, right? We just don't have even a fraction, not even a fraction of that kind of time, money, or energy to be able to create that for ourselves, right? And a lot of people are trying to build their brand through content and stuff like this. Well, actually, one of the biggest ways of building your brand is by having specific content that talks to a specific audience, and that audience will see it every day from you, every day. And they might not remember your name still, because that's what we're like, right? You go to a party, you might see the same person 5 times. You don't turn to your wife, your husband, and say, oh yeah, do you remember Claudia? Claudia. What you'll do is you say, even if you remember her name, you'll say, you remember Claudia? Who's Claudia? The one with purple hair. The one that was talking to us about engineering, the one that had just come back from the cruise ship. That's how they remember us. That's how we start to stand out. Over time, yes, they start to learn our names and our brands and stuff like that. But to get from being one of everybody else that's doing random posts about random stuff, you start to show up on the radar of these specific niche audience that you've decided you want to target as potential customers. So now you become the one. They don't know who you are, but you know the guy that puts all that engineering stuff out. You know, Tracy, my partner, she's on here. She's monitoring the questions. Keep putting your questions in. She may answer them there and then, and we'll back end some, and I'll do some Q&A at the end, right? But Tracy's monitoring that, and Tracy's in winter dogs. We've got German Shepherd and that, and she loves them. And she follows all these dogs, right, on social media because it makes her happy and stuff like that. Okay, and she doesn't remember like specific dog people, if you want to call it that, right? She's just liked and followed. And there's a massive dog stuff that comes through. But the German Shepherd one, for example, because we have a German Shepherd, the German Shepherd one, she'll know who they are, but she'll remember them still as the German Shepherd one. She'll have to go and find them. And if you want to go look for a feed, she'll have to go and find, she won't remember who they are, who the name of the person is, but she'll know they're the German Shepherd one. So this is how we get known in the marketplace. This is how we start to leverage ourselves out in that really crowded, super competitive marketplace. So it's going to hugely benefit our marketing. We can do far less marketing to try and, you know, get known to engineering, healthcare, whatever, to try and get known as a website builder when there's millions of website builders out there. Go onto LinkedIn, type in website builders, right? I'm going to get the phone book in front of me. So when there's all these different website designers out there and everything else, how can you possibly stand out as a website designer? Does this make sense? If you're looking to scale your business, local community, yeah, you'll stand out because you'll go networking, your face is there. I love networking for early day strategies. Take you well over 100K networking, will, because you'll turn up to a room, you'll meet people, you'll talk about what you do. You're already niched, if you like, because you're the only one that's in that room, or certainly one of maybe only a couple in that room. So you already have an audience, if you want to call it that. But if you want to go bigger, you want to scale bigger, you need to start to connect with people that are outside of your immediate network. You need to start to get known outside of your frame of reference and your field of experience. You need to start getting recognized, right, on a wider stage. So what happens here is you start to really step up, or I should say more focus your marketing, which gives you the leads to generate the sales, which gives you the delivery. Then you increase your people. And this little triangle here is how you scale a business, just here. You sell more, you deliver more. You have to hire really well in order to support the delivery and maybe the sales. You need to keep up in your marketing game because you need a constant flow of good quality leads into your sales. And you go round and round this, and this is how you scale your business. Once you've got these first three in place, these three are what you get your foot down on. Systems and processes and finances, they play increasingly a bigger part in the business world or in your business world as this gets more complicated. So as you've got more delivery, more sales, more people, obviously systems and process become increasingly more important. Finances and financials become increasingly more important. Does this make sense? When you look at the model like this, I'll just share it one more time. In fact, I'll share it here. When you look at this model here, when I think, right, all I've got to do is get this stuff right up front. And then I just need to keep getting this slicker and slicker, more efficient, more effective, more productive, right? That's going to be fundamentally the engine that grows your business, or the activity that's going to grow your business. And so many of us, we're scattered, we're thinking about, I must do tons of this, I must do tons of that, and I've got to get this in place and that in place. And you're thinking, no, what I'm going to do, I've got to sell more. If I don't sell more, I don't have a business. I've got to sell more. If I sell more, I've then got to make sure I keep up with the delivery. To keep up with delivery, I may need some extra help. You will at some point undoubtedly need extra help. And to keep the leads coming, I need to keep improving my marketing. And as long as I keep focusing on these things here, and these things I take on at the appropriate time, you're going to have you're going to need to have a monitor of your finances from day one. However, when you're running £1 million business, this becomes a much bigger part of this model than it is at the beginning. The same as systems and processes. Does this make sense? So that gives you a run through of your business and your model, and hopefully already starts to show you just how important it is to actually niche. Okay, so the next slide I want to share with you. In fact, let's do a quick poll. I've got another poll for you guys. Let's do another quick poll. So if we can get the second poll up, please. This would be an interesting one as well. Have you niched already? Have you thought about niching, for example? I'd like to know where you're at. I'd love to know where you're at. So if you just tick one of those boxes, guys, and let us know again just who's on this webinar. Yes, I have a great niche. I've thought about it, but I'm worried about the sales I'll lose, or absolutely not, and never will. Right? Which one of those are you? Right? Yes, you have a niche, or you might even think you've got a great niche. In which case, great. Hopefully, this will just solidify that for you. Right? It will be like to pressure test that. And then I've thought about it, but I'm worried about the sales I lose. That's a huge one, right? That's such a big fear for business owners. Okay, once you niche, you'll never look back, right? But at the beginning, for ourselves included, by the way, and one of the reasons it took us a while to niche ourselves is because no one really explained it as succinctly, hopefully, as I'm explaining it to you, or certainly maybe not as compellingly as hopefully I'm explaining it to you. It was just a case, yeah, you need to focus and, all that sort of stuff. It wasn't, I'm that guy that says, but why? That kind of mechanical mind. I want to take it apart, break it apart, see how it works. And unfortunately, I never met anyone that truly understood it. Right. Excellent. Okay. No judgment here. Well done. Thank you for being honest. Okay, 50%, you've got a niche already. Awesome. You've come on here because I'm assuming you want to just make sure that's right. So I'm preaching to the converted maybe already here, right? And you're looking, how can you step it up again a level? And 50% almost on the other one, right? I've thought about it, but I'm worried about the sales I lose. Really, I can't tell you the number of conversations I have. It's very, very rare that any of my members, it's really, really rare that we don't have to have some kind of one-to-one or some kind of coaching conversation to help them to get over that fear. Even when they've seen presentations like this, they're like, I get it, I'm sold. And then the fear creeps in. I'm going to lose what I'm going to lose. If I'm going for that much, I'm going to miss all of that. So let me share with you, hopefully, something else that's going to reiterate what I've just said, whilst also answering that question, hopefully. Okay. So the example I'm going to use with you today is your dog groomer. Okay, so either imagine your dog groomer or transpose what I'm saying about dog grooming into your specific business. Okay, so I go out to the market, and this is the market, right? And there's all kinds of different dogs in there. Okay, we've got is that a Basset? I think it's a Basset. This little thing here, whatever the hell that is. Is that a St. Bernard? I think it is, right? So we've got all these different dogs, Huskies, Alsatians, all those sorts of things on here, right? So this is the general market. And what happens is, as I've already said, we tend to go out to the marketplace, okay? Because I've got some dog grooming skills, whatever the version of that is that you've got. I've got dog grooming skills, so I go out and I'll groom dogs, right? You're commoditizing what you do. And you'll find some clients because it'll be, you know, friends of friends, networking, people you know, local dog parks, whatever, right? And you'll do a good job, right? If you're good at that, if you're up for hustling and selling and stuff, you'll get your business off the ground, right? You might even get it, you know, I don't know, 50 grand, something like that. If you throw in some networking there and stuff like that, I believe you can probably get that up to about 100 grand, right? Just by going out there and even being the generalist and stuff like that. However, if you really want to create a successful business, it's gonna wear out very, very quickly. Okay, so you want to get it in place sooner because it's going to support you and it's going to make everything easier right from the get-go. Even though you might get away with not doing it, if you want to call it that, for the first couple of phases of your business, certainly maybe getting towards that 50K. At some point, I'm going to tell every single person they need to go out there and niche, right? So imagine now this is our competitor. So our competitor's been in the market for 10 years, 20 years, whatever it might be, maybe 100 years, right? And they've got all these case studies and they've got all this position in the marketplace and they're really well known and they are a generalist. But look at them, right? They're clearly the number one generalist when we look at the experience that they've got. The problem we've got is if I start my small little business, you know, I look like that, okay, compared to they're looking like that. So again, the question is, why would anyone use me? Why would anyone come to me when they could come to that person or to that company? The reason they will come to you is because you've got personal relationships with them and stuff like that. That's great, but that is not a scalable model, right? Does that make sense? You know, my local community, my local networks and stuff like that, they can get you a long way, but they're not going to get you all the way. I need to be able to go out and attract a wider market. And even if I can get where I want to get to by doing it the other way, you know, by going out there and just hustling a little bit and that, why wouldn't you, even if you want to do that, bring in a little bit more of this as well, right? Because it makes a lot more sense to make things easier for you and you're setting up your future. Typically, the only way I'm going to compete at this level with this company is because I'm either known to you in some way, directly or through an associate, for example. You're in my local vicinity. We happen to meet, chance happenings, you know, or I happen just to drop you a call, drop you a line or whatever it might be, right? However, right, that's kind of the limit of this model. It took this company maybe 10, 20 years to get to that point. Does that make sense? Maybe longer, right? So the way that we can compete with this and the way that we can get in there, looking at this, remember the Coke conversation I've already had, is we don't look at this and say, right, I need to compete directly with this company. I can't compete. I'm always going to get the leftovers, or I'm going to get just whatever happens to be hanging around. I want to go in there and niche, right? So let's say we say, I'm going to go in and I'm going to niche on poodle breeds, right? Or doodles, I call them, right? So all the doodles, right? So poodles and poodle crosses, okay? So, you know, and the way I come to that, and I'll share this with you in a minute, but I'm looking and think, right, who am I best placed to serve? Who do I like working with? Who's willing to pay the money and stuff like that? And we'll talk about that in just a second, right? How you might go about niching. But fundamentally, I get to a conclusion that this is a good niche for me. I might go out and do a little bit of market research, you know, for dog groomers, it'd be simple. And I might go out to some local dog communities or dog groups, for example, social media, do a quick poll, how many of these breeds are within 20 minutes and you know, and how far you're willing to go for the right groomer, and you end up right. Okay, right. There's a million of these things, you know, within 20-minute drive, and so I know I've got a good niche. So you know, you might want to do some sense checking before you go in on your niche like that. Just make sure there's enough market. If you are a local based business, just enough of that market for you to serve. Okay, it's really unlikely unless you're going for like, you know, 50 million, 100 million. It's really unlikely you're going to niche to the point where you run out of clients. Okay, so we're going to go and specialize on doodles. Okay. So we set up day one looking like this. On day one, we look like this and we go out to market. Now, just like I've already said in that previous model when I was showing you the cogs of the business engine, the model, what happens here, of course, is that we start to stand out. Now, there is a risk, and this is the fear, right? The risk is that these people don't pay attention. But guess what? When I'm randomly putting a husky out there or a beagle out there or whatever, they're not paying attention anyway. It's an illusion. We think they're paying attention, but they're not. They're already disregarding us. Does this make sense? So what we're going to do is we're going to be proactive about it and say, right, I'm not disregarding these people. I'm just focusing on these guys. And these guys, now I can go out there and I can communicate to these people. My website can be designed specifically with these people in mind. My LinkedIn profile, specifically talking about these people. All my content on LinkedIn, specifically talking about these people. My case studies, all these people. My recommendations and referrals, all these people. Does that make sense? And then you'll be the poodle guy. And then once you get known as being the poodle guy, then you'll get known as your company, your brand. Does this make sense? Very, very quickly, instead of your company looking like that, very, very quickly, you'll look like that. I go to your website and that's all I see. I go to your LinkedIn, that's all I see. I go to your recommendations, that's all I see. Your case studies, that's all I see. People like me with my kind of problem, with my kind of solution that I'm looking to achieve. That's what I see over and over and over again. When I go to this person here, for example, straight away, they look like the cheap option to me. When I come and speak to you and they say, why are you so expensive? Why are you so expensive? And you sit there and say, because this is all we do. All we do is what you're looking to achieve. That's all we do, day in and day out. And you wouldn't use this language, right? But the subtext is these other companies that might have, like 10 times as much experience as us actually have a fraction of our experience with this particular thing. Does this make sense? So I'm not competing. The fact that I've been in business, like you guys are launching right now, the fact that I've been in business for minutes compared to someone for years, or for you guys that have been going around for years compared to people that have been around for decades, we're no longer competing on that. What we're competing on is really simple. Who's best to solve your problem? And if this is my experience and this is what I'm set up to do, I have more experience than this guy at your problem. Does that make sense? So when someone says to you, you're a little bit more expensive, or why are you so expensive? It's because this is all we do. This is all we do all day in, day in. If this is what you want, if this is the solution you want, then we're the people for you. There are always going to be people cheaper than us. And if that's what you choose, then I understand, right? Again, I'm not saying that would be your sales tactics, but that's kind of the subtext. What that means is this generalist out there, even if they might have been perceived originally as the flagship company, if you want to call it that, suddenly become the step down. Suddenly they become the one I don't really want to go to, because now I really want to go with you because I really want that outcome and I can see you're the right person. So now it becomes hard for me to go to this person, even though they're a little bit cheaper. Does this make sense? That doesn't mean you're not going to lose their business. It just means it's harder, right? It's harder for people to not follow through with you. So the last thing I'm going to share with you guys, and so please get your questions in. I think we've got quite a few, so I'm going to give us plenty of time for questions. And this is the last thing I want to share with you is a little formula for how you might start to niche, right? That means nothing to you, but it's a prompt for me. Okay. So when you think about it, if this is the entire market here, right? This is the whole market. What you're going to do is you're going to say, right, who am I best placed? Who am I best placed to serve? If you've been in business and you're doing over 100K, you've got enough clients behind you now to know who you're really well placed. Who do you get the best results from? Who do you like working with the most? Who's got the deepest pockets is willing to pay for a really good solution? This talk I do on niche, and I'll be honest with you, is quite a few hours long normally. It's quite a condensed version, so I can't give you everything. I'm just trying to give you as much as I can. So there's a whole process for that. I'm going to shortcut and say, right, we decide that this piece here is the best piece for us. It meets a lot of criteria. I enjoy working with them. I'm already quite highly skilled with this. I get good results with these people. These people are really good clients, right? They do what they're meant to do and they make me look good and stuff like that. I have like 10 questions I do. And one of those is they make you look good, right? Your niche needs to make you look good. And they need to really desire what you've got. You need to be mission critical to them, but it also needs to be, they need to be willing to pay and they have to have the money to pay. So I'm going to say, right, this is my niche. So imagine we take that little box and that little box now becomes this big box, right? So this isn't the whole market. This is now just that little part of the market. The first cut you want to do, and this is a really simplified version of what I do. The first cut you want to do, and it is a cut where we disregard all this, is we sit there and we say, right, market, vertical market, right? Healthcare, engineering, something like that. Now, a lot of people think that's niching. It's not niching, right? It's a huge market still, and you don't really stand out. If you say, I do HR for engineering companies, yeah, it's less competitive, but it's still super competitive. So the first cut is vertical market. The second cut you're going to make, okay? The second cut you're going to make, and that cuts out all of this, is going to be specific problem that you're best to solve. So rather than I do HR, generic HR for generic engineering firms, I'm going to maybe go more specific on the type of engineering firms, you know, like under so many people who are looking to scale, right? That would be a pretty good niche to go in on, right? Companies have real trouble retaining employees, for example. So it might be small companies, fast growth trajectories that don't have great retention, right? You start to really stand out. You're also really valuable to that client. Does that make sense? So the fast growth, they're looking for fast growth part and retention. That becomes the next one, right? Sorry, that's the third one. The next one is specific problem. The specific problem is I lose people, right? I lose people. I can't hold on to people. And then a specific outcome would be that final cut. So we'll do a final cut. And all we're left with then, right, is this little piece here. And that's what we're going to own. And no one's going to touch us on that piece, because when I talk about anything on social media, I'm talking about that piece. When I'm all my case studies will be referencing that piece. Specific market with a specific problem with a specific desired outcome. When you get known for that, I'm the HR person that works with smaller, fast growth engineering firms that can't retain staff, that want to increase the retention of their staff so they can continue the acceleration pace of their thing, right? That is a very, very, very powerful value proposition compared to 99% of your competition, maybe 99.9% of your competition that will go into that market and say, yeah, we can do HR. HR's HR. Straight away, right? You sound expensive, you look expensive. The last thing I will share, and then we'll get these questions up. We'll invite Tracy on to start sharing these questions. The last thing I'll say is what happens very quickly is, even if you're not an expert in that field right now, right? So you might be a generalist now, but you know this is a good market for you and you enjoy this market and you think you're quite good at this market and you could make this a really good, powerful niche for you. You start to move into that niche. That's great for marketing and positioning and sales straight away from day one. However, what it's also really powerful for, 10 clients down the road, you'd have had 10 random clients. Your skill base would have gone up like a millimeter. When you do 10 of these clients with the same problems and everything else, suddenly, right, you become an expert of this. So even if you're not an expert right now, suddenly you become an expert very quickly, because these are the same problems you see recurring over and over again. The first time you meet them, it could take you a degree of time to work through that problem and understand it. Second time, a little bit less. Second time, a little bit less. After 10 of these clients, you'll go straight in there, pin. This is the problem. This is your problem. This is what you need to do. Fix. Does that make sense? Also, your language patterns will shift. You'll start to speak the language of your audience and your client base. They'll see you as really understanding them. They'll see you as one of their own. And you will start to really stand out. You'll become an expert. You'll be sought after. I'm not saying this is something that's going to happen tomorrow. This is something that we're going to build over time as we start to build our businesses. Right. I could go on forever. Tracy knows that. However, you've got very specific questions. So I invite Tracy on here to share some of your questions. And yeah, we'll crack on.
So we have some absolutely awesome questions that have come in. So I'm going to pick off a few. I'm going to hopefully get through as many as I can in the next 10 minutes, because we're going to strictly finish at 11. Any that we don't get to, we will do our best to write some answers for you and follow up afterwards if we can manage that. So if you don't get to it today.
So I'm just going to jump in very quickly, Trace. While you ask these questions, I'm just going to put this screen up in the background, guys. Hopefully you can see that. Can you set it just about, it doesn't show up too hot. I'll leave that on just for a second. We've got some events coming up. If you're at the launch phase, biggerbrighterbolder.co.uk/successful launch. Build phase is you guys under the 100K that want to hit 100K. biggerbrighterbolder.co.uk/100K. It's about how to get to 100K, what you need to do. And for you scale guys that are already doing 100K and want to move us over 100K and want to move towards that million mark, biggerbrighterbolder.co.uk/scale up. So I'm going to leave that on the screen just for a second, Trey. So anyone that wants to go and check out what we've got coming up, this is all about helping businesses go to that next level, helping businesses to achieve that next place, from launching to building, from building to scale and scaling and beyond. Okay, I'll leave it on there for a second. And Tracy, go away, hit me up.
All right, so we've got a question from Deborah Topping. So I have an information governance consultancy and training company, think GDPR. It applies to all sectors and the pure legislation doesn't vary for different sectors. Is it worth trying to niche just for scaling a business? I work with lots of charities and health at the moment, but not the most profitable sectors for me.
Yeah, so one of the questions, I talk about these 10 questions, right, I go through. One of the questions in there is they have to really, truly value, your niche needs to truly value what it is that you do, but they also need to be able to pay like the specialist prices. So sometimes we can have this kind of heart-mind tug of war going on. Does that make sense? A little bit of a heart and mind thing going on where my heart wants to serve this particular demographic, but my business mind knows that they can't necessarily afford it. So straight off the bat, I'd say, I understand. I'm not saying you shouldn't or you can't create a niche out of healthcare, for example, and stuff like that. I'm also not going to say that you can't get good money out of healthcare. It just might not be out of the healthcare elements that maybe you're serving right now. But yeah, I genuinely believe that niching, even because I get it, right? We do it a lot where we think, you know, at the end of the day, what I do is a generic thing, right? And it is it's a washer, right? So it's a washer. This washer I could put anywhere, right? I could put it in a kid's toy. I could put it in a washing machine. I could put it into a space shuttle. Well, clearly that washer is worth more to the space shuttle, assuming it's up to grade, right? Top level washers. That washer is worth a lot more to the space shuttle, like or to NASA, than it is to the washing machine company, and it's worth more to the washing machine company than maybe the cheap £1 knockoff kind of toy thing around the corner, right? So actually, by targeting the right market, assuming you're already doing a 5-star service, with what most service-based businesses are, they're doing 5-star service, but they're selling it at 2-star prices because they're selling it as a general washer, rather than saying, I've got an awesome washer and I'm selling it to people that really value awesome washers. Does that make sense? So that way, right? Obviously, you can see what I've said before. It makes so much sense. But I think it would have more impact than maybe you're thinking, actually. But even the answer to your question is yes, it would still help you massively when it comes to targeting, marketing, and selling your product. But I think it would actually have a bigger knock on than maybe you're thinking the other areas that I'm already talking about. However, just to simply answer your question, yeah, it is definitely still worth niching because everyone else will think the same as you and everyone else will say it's the same. Now, you need to be able to say it's different, right? If it is literally the same, you can't, but just the fact you'll understand their language patterns and their specific implementation of it will already set you aside. Does that make sense? Even if it is, GDPR, whatever equivalent of it is GDPR, yeah, but I understand the unique way that this thing's tackled in this environment, or even just the unique way the people think about it in that environment makes you a specialist. Some industries, yeah, we adopt stuff really easily. Other ones, they're more resistant. So look at the personalities you're serving as well, because they are also your niche. You work with organizations that are resistant to change, right? For example. Hopefully that answers it in a short way.
Yeah, good. Okay, so this is from Deborah Woodhouse. So we are a recording studio commissioned to create audiobooks for publishers. So our business is B2B. This is a fairly crowded market at the moment, as this is a growth industry with publishers using many studios, mostly in London, and seemingly able to keep prices low. There is a lot of secrecy around pricing, and it is difficult to stand out. Advice, please.
Yeah, advice. So I would definitely, we've seen them before, a little bit of, what do they call it? Secret shopping sometimes can help. It's kind of getting someone to kind of go in and kick a few tires and try and find that out. What is the pricing that other people are doing, for example, talking to the market. So when you do talk to your clients, try and get the information out of those guys, maybe, what's going on in the marketplace and stuff like that. I know some markets are really closed and they can be really, really difficult. The main thing that makes it is competitive, you're right, and people may well go on price, right? So again, it's looking for, do you have a specific set of skills that would be specifically seen as more beneficial to one particular part of that market for whatever reason, right? Does this make sense? Now, I'm not saying you go down this route, right? But for example, I don't know, it could be people who are, I'm trying to think now. It could be self-publishing people who aren't particularly confident on the microphone, and you create environments for those guys. I'm not saying that'd be a good niche, by the way, but for example, that kind of thinking, right? So we could think about not just the vertical niche, kids' books or whatever books. We could be thinking specifically around the individual that we're serving, right? It could be tapping into an anxiety that they have, a resistance they have, or a particular desire that they have, or personality trait. And sometimes that can be something that we tune into. Does that make sense? And we start to make our offering, a hotel is a hotel. But what they do is they still target a certain demographic, they target a business demographic by shifting just the brand, how it looks, maybe the experience when they turn up compared to families and things like that. And obviously there's other things in place, like you might put a kid swing in and stuff like that. But we're looking for those little nuances. So I totally understand that it can be really, really hard. I do believe it's in there, by the way. I say I have these sort of 10 questions that I go through people, so it takes a little while. But I do believe you still have a niche in there, right? And that niche is to then work out who are you best placed to serve, so that you can bring the best value to this particular individual or this particular business, so they can see that you're different and you stand out, and they can get to know you for something rather than just another audiobook producer or another studio or whatever it might be.
Okay, so another question. I'm literally starting this week after many years in the corporate world. I offer credit management and credit control solutions to assist customers to increase their cash flow. I totally understand the importance of a niche, but when you first start, how do you decide who to niche to?
Yeah, so hopefully, I think that was an earlier question or a later question. Excuse me. Hopefully, that helped a little bit, right, in terms of how to start going about that niche, right? So it's a vertical market that maybe you either stand out to, or a vertical market that maybe that you've got past experience with, right? So if you work within banking, for example, yeah, and then you move into something else like personal training, but it doesn't really relate to banking. The fact you've got a lot of history of banking gives you an edge as one of their own. Does that make sense? And that already makes you start to stand out, that you're one of their own. What it might be, you might understand the particular pressures they're under, or whatever, the time constraints, or whatever it might be. Okay, so for me, it's starting with that process. The first question could be, right, who am I best positioned to serve? And if you've been around for a little while and you've got history, you look at those past clients and you say, right, who did I really do a good job on? Who did I really understand? And then there's other questions I bring in, these 10 questions, one of which is, who do I enjoy working with? We just need to make sure the commercials are right before we get involved. Like, because sometimes we chase the exciting, fun projects, but we don't do the commercials, which is it's good paying work and whatever, like reliable companies or whatever. So we do the commercials first and then make sure that it tallies up to my own personal passions as well. So I would actually start with the commercials first, right? Who am I best positioned to work with? Who's going to value what I do the most? Who can pay for that? And then look at, for example, who's going to make me look good, who shares similar values to me and stuff like that. It's not saying they're less important. It's just saying we then align at the end with those things with ourselves to make sure that we're working with a client base that works for us as an individual as well. Short answers I appreciate to probably really deep like questions. We could probably spend half an hour on each one. But that's the starting process. Who am I best positioned to serve? Who's going to value what I do the most? Who's, when I look at all my skill set and my past experience, who does that most serve? Who does that give the best benefit to? That's a really good place to be. And start with a big picture, like an industry sector, and then go into those other questions. Problem to solve, want a specific outcome. If you've got history, it's easier than if you're starting out. If you're starting out, you've kind of got to do not guesswork, but you've got to be a bit more creative and a bit more project a little bit forward. If you've been around for 5 years and you've had 500 clients, much easier to look backwards and start to pull patterns out on that. And on that note, I will hand back over to you, Ruth.
Thank you so much, George. I think we could talk about this for hours. I'm not surprised your normal sessions are more like about 3 hours than an hour. So thank you for reducing it down today. And thank you so much for all the great advice. What I'm really hoping is that, and I'm sure you have, that you've given people the confidence today to give creating a niche a try. So rather than worrying that it's going to lose them sales, to understand, I mean, certainly it's been very clearly shown to me that, it's going to generate more sales by specializing rather than less. So hopefully we've given some of the audience the confidence to do that today, and I'm sure you'd be really happy to have a chat with them if they've still got further questions. I will be doing an article for the FSB website about the event, so we can put any questions that haven't been answered, we can put some responses to that on there. And as I mentioned at the beginning, the recording will be available if you want to watch it again and just recap on the points that George made during his talk. But thank you so much. It's been a really interesting session and the time has just flown by. And thank you for joining us in the audience. If you've enjoyed the event today, please do give us a review on Trustpilot. We'd love to have a positive review because it just tells people that what we're doing is supporting yourselves or businesses, and that's one of the ways that people can find about it. So please do talk about it. Please do have a look at the On Demand website, and we hope to see you at another one of our events soon. So thank you so much for joining us today. Goodbye.
Thanks a lot, guys.